Nate Diaz submits Tony Ferguson in the 4th round, a back-and-forth affair. Of course, I did the instant reaction. So, BC, the fans have not heard from you. I'm wondering if they could be louder. It's not quite loud enough.
This is a tight room, very tight in here.
So answer me this. How impressed were you with how Nate Diaz performed? We'll talk about Tony in just a second. How did Nate look?
They look really good, but we do have to adjust our expectations for the matchup there. Obviously, this was not an easy situation for anybody with 3 fights, 6 fighters all getting reworked and getting new opponents. Like, I think we kind of have to start there, separate even from Nate. Is, Luke, how do we sum up one of the wildest stretches of combat sports at the most elite promotional level, from like the backroom brawl Thursday that canceled the press conference, through the star of the pay-per-view missing weight by 8.5 pounds, through the top 3 fights all got flipped, and then were actually better fights after they salvaged it.
Not sure if that's true.
On paper, it was. On paper,
sure,
it was.
yes.
I think that's even separate from, to a degree, from Nate's performance and what's next. Like, I think this is UFC at their finest. I think if you're a pro wrestling fan, this is great right here. That's fantastic. There we go. We're just gonna put. I mean, it's going great, guys. No, we're live. Okay, there we go.
Dude, high as balls.
I've always said that in pro wrestling, like Vince McMahon, WWE, always at their best when shit falls apart and they've got to go last minute. Dude, I got to give the UFC credit. Like, this was a really, really fun last 2-3 days leading into a fight card that was
give the fighters credit
that was going to put a lot of eyes and attention anyway, because there's Nate and there's Khamzat. Dude, this was like where you didn't know what was going to happen next. Poirier said he was like ready to go and get a flight to like save the main event. There was a couple of those scenarios. Wasn't this like, it's not unprecedented. We had this for UFC 200 when John Jones had to pull out. We had this for UFC 223 where...
I can't recall the last time 3 at the top, though.
Well, even 223 was different because you had the Dolly, you had Khabib going from, Tony to Holloway to suddenly Iaquinta, and we didn't know if it was going to be Pettis. But I will have to say this, Luke. It added an edge and an element of like realism. It created plenty of conspiracy theories that we can all shoot down or laugh at or play into, whatever. I mean, this was fun. I like this shit.
It was fun. I thought that the overall, in terms of the reshuffling, I don't know that it created better fights. I don't feel that it did. The main event to me was perfectly good.
Okay, but how do you feel like it didn't create better fights?
I thought that the D-Rod fight and the Leach fight, that they were a little bit uncomfortable with what they were both going up against, and so they kind of fought single strike distance, as opposed to really mixing it up.
So you're saying the actual performances as compared to the on-paper upgrades in the end?
We talked about this on this show. Don't you agree that not all the time, not every time, there's plenty of exceptions, boxing too, but a lot of times when guys get really last-minute changes, 48 hours, things like that, a lot of times the fights end up being fine, but somewhat reserved because both guys don't know what to expect. I feel like that bled through, not with Khamzat, but in the feature fight and then a little bit in the main event.
I mean, that was the same case with Anderson Silva and Daniel Cormier at
UFC 200.
It was just
where they get an OSP and John Jones.
I'm saying for keeping this fight card together, your interest level into it, and maybe even heightening, which brings us back to Nate. Luke, this was, people rip me on Twitter for saying this, but I stand by it. This was the gangster exit that Nate Diaz deserved the whole time as being a legend.
You got ripped for that?
Yeah, just sort of saying, oh, Tony, this. Dude, Tony fought his balls off for being exactly who he is, coming off a 4-fight, losing skid and 37 years old.
Yeah.
The fight wasn't great. It was weird as shit. Round 3, I didn't know what was happening. When they were circling away from each other, Nate's doing Nick Diaz things, Tony's doing Nick Diaz things. I thought for a hot second that was going to be Nate doing the middle finger walk off, I'm done, F you guys. I'm glad that it didn't happen because Nate gets the win, the stoppage, and then the hero's exit. I mean, they were puffing up his bag in the post-fight interview, calling him a legend. When would you have ever have guessed that A, that would have happened, or B, that he wasn't going to have to pull off a miracle first and go through Khamzat Chimaev to get there? So all in all, Nate did the exact opposite of what the original matchmaking was intended, to take his star power and rub it all over Chimaev. And instead, we not only didn't get that chance, but Nate exit with his brand increased from this, right? His brand, he almost exited as a hero, where traditionally he was the anti-hero. Traditionally we cheered for him because he was like the villain who's like, F the company, F the man. This time he came back around and had like a baby-faced moment, and he earned it and deserved it. I loved it. I loved everything about it.
Of all the ways this weekend could have gone, of all the various permutations, I can't call this the very best because if you think about it, let's say he had actually fought Khamzat and then submitted him or something in some kind of amazing performance. That would have been so enormous that no one would have been able to take it away from him. I don't think it was that, but I think it's just one step down. That's it. I don't think it's a whole lot different. It's different, but I still think that what he got out of this, to your point, is the exact opposite of where everything ultimately was headed. Is there a way to grade, I'm not sure how to word this exactly, the level of triumph? Like what realistically does this do for him, do you think?
Okay, realistically,
And
like
I don't mean like the Jake Paul fight. I mean
in terms
like
of triumph and
stature.
consequence, it's another legendary name that he defeated. And I think what we at least saw was that Tony poured out the best of what he could have had in this situation. New opponent, losing streak, all that.
Mm-hmm.
It was a tough, interesting, I mean, Nate's, the leg strikes he was absorbing, you were starting to question, is he going to be, heading into peril? Is Tony going to pull off this miracle win? That didn't happen. I give the UFC like an A+ for saving the card and actually upgrading it. I give the ending in the end for Nate. I mean, we say that all the time. Legends don't get that. Anderson Silva didn't get that for his UFC exit. Nobody gets that. Nate needed the most ridiculous set of circumstances to flip for it to happen. I mean, we've got to shout out Mike Heck from MMA Fighting.
We do.
The New Englander.
I like him, but what did he do?
Maybe 2 times already in the past week on this show, I brought to you his theory, hey, what if for some unknown reason,
Oh, Jesus, that was him?
Chimaev gets injured or misses weight, and suddenly it's Tony versus Nate? Because the whole idea was Nate was going to have to. I mean, think about that narrative coming in. Nate was fighting the machine. He didn't want to fight Chimaev. I think he knew in the back of his mind there's pretty much an unwinnable fight. I mean, it's not unwinnable, but it's, this is what I have to do to cash out. This is what I have to do to get out of here, to be free. And he instead, just by receiving good MMA karma for being true to his beliefs and his street justice and all that the whole time, the good karma came back to him. He got to have a moment. The fans enjoyed it. Now he doesn't exit damaged or another rough loss that he didn't need. Now he gets to go wherever he's going on a lift. Dude, this was a feel-good moment. It's a weird moment. So I want to, before we exit the whole talk about the craziness, Luke, I texted you at one point in the midst of it, maybe Friday evening, was like, is this shit staged? Is this a pro wrestling thing? Everything's just coming together too perfect. And you're like, I don't think so. I thought Dana actually gave the best response Saturday night after the fights and saying, do you know how crazy the 6 guys are that we had to give new fights to? Do you think they could pull off an organized conspiracy? I will agree with him on this. But let me toss one remotely possible conspiracy theory at you, and I want to hear what you say about it, okay?
All conspiracy theories are remotely possible.
Okay, we did see Dana, whether it was fear out of Nate, walking out of a cage during a fight and flipping everybody off or not, receive Nate in like you're an MMA legend. I have nothing bad to say about you. I mean, to hear Nate in the post-fight interview be like, I've always loved Dana, all love. Something must have happened, in my opinion, during fight week, Luke.
I talked about this on Friday.
Where they got to a certain level of respect, but maybe they got to a really good level of respect where Dana's like, this is kind of dirty what we did. The reality right now is unless we're putting Khamzat in a title fight, he probably should be facing somebody like Holland right now to see exactly where he is. Maybe they talked to Nate. I don't know anything, I'm just putting it out there. And they said, look, Nate, we want you to have this trilogy with McGregor under our banner. Go do what you need to do, go make your money, but agree with us that you're going to come back and do this with us. And maybe that was enough for them to go, hey, Khamzat, come here, bro. We're going to have to flip this shit upside down. So we're going to tell everybody that you missed weight really badly, and you're going to act like you don't care. Because, Luke, you're going to tell me I'm crazy, right?
Yes.
Then what kind of surreal, shit was the last few days? It was when Mike Heck pitched that possibility, we're all like, oh my God, what kind of karma would have to come together for something that awesome to happen? It happened step by step. But the thing to me that's still unbelievable is how Chimaev, who beat 2 guys in 10 days, could be that far overweight.
So his coach, I just saw this before we went live. I retweeted it from Sean El-Shadi. I guess the coach, let's get those phones on.
And I'm not sitting here saying I believe this.
People's
Luke.
phones are ringing.
Yeah,
I mean, this is. What are we doing?
I'm just saying there are a lot of people DMing me going, I can't.
So what his coach said, again, this is not me making it up. This is what his coach said. And by the way, you could say he's wrong too. I'm just going to relay the information. Remember that Khamzat had a real bad bout with COVID, kind where it was kind of fucked him up real good, right? So he's obviously, in terms of what he can do on fight night, he seems just fine. But what his coach said was, ever since that time, his body's been a little bit weird, and he can't make welterweight as easily. Obviously he did it against Gilbert Burns, but apparently it was a Herculean effort. Now, is his coach right? I don't know. Is that the reason? I don't know. But
I mean, look, this is among the most unprofessional, whether it was medically induced or not.
Let me say this too. Here's something to think about. A buddy of mine one time tried to make his Bellator debut. He eventually made it later, but he went to the weight cut process, never had an issue, And then when he got there, this was in California, his heart rate was elevated, and they actually wouldn't let him cut weight. And I asked him, I was like, how did you feel? He's like, I felt fine. I could have easily cut weight. That what they said was that the doctors didn't let Khamzat cut the weight. Khamzat wanted to. So what I'm wondering is if there was something that was flagged in like a medical screening related to that, because I do know for a fact a buddy of mine had that, had a very plausible thing that happened to him that could have been what happened to
Because look, when Gervonta missed
Wolf.
on the scale and lost his title in the Mayweather-McGregor co-main event, we were like, okay, maybe he's got to clean up his discipline outside the ring. This is a guy who's crazy disciplined. I'm still shocked that this happened. Even if everything's on the up and up, I'm still shocked that
this is the other part too, BC, and I made this, I think, on my live chat. We didn't talk about it. We should very quickly. Remember, all the athletes have to weigh in at the beginning of the week. The UFC knows when they get to Vegas or however long he was there, they knew on fight week where he was that Monday or Tuesday. He had to come in and weigh in. So maybe nothing was flagged then. I don't know. That's sort of, no, we should have, that should have been asked to Dana then.
I mean, do I really believe it's a conspiracy? No. But it's just, I've never seen somebody who, like, as much as the media was making this event about Nate, and it certainly became about Nate once they made the
Khamzat
change.
did everything he
This
could.
was about Khamzat.
Yes.
Promotionally,
Yes,
business-wise,
100%, yes.
this was all about taking Nate's fans and giving them to Khamzat. And to see him have a mishap is surprising enough. But what about the way he's responded character-wise?
I want to save some of this conversation for his fight, but the last thing I would say is I thought Khamzat, this ultimately, it's amazing that Nate Diaz even got the headlines that he did when you really think about it, because Khamzat, either inadvertently or whatever, but basically did everything possible to make that week about him. From the brawl, or not the brawl, but the conflict with Paulo Costa, to the backstage, to the way, and every day Khamzat was like the top of the news, not for good reason, but he was the guy there, by hook or by crook, he was the guy up there. And then Nate, I think, managed to wrestle back a little bit of that limelight, obviously a lot of it on Saturday. But that's sort of my reading.
Okay, well, we'll save on Khamzat, and he certainly repaired a good chunk of the bad will with the performance.
I'm not sure he did.
All right, we'll get into that, but I really cannot believe this happened. I can't believe it's among the most bizarre stretches we have ever seen in combat sports. Because in boxing, they would just cancel the card.
Here's the thing about combat sports you really got to understand when you're in it long enough. And if you're a fan, obviously, if you're a hardcore fan, and most of you watching certainly are. But the thing you got to remember is, and we feel this like acutely, especially when you're at an event. Like I was at the event where, I wasn't there when Conor threw the dolly, but I was there. It was the Holloway Khabib Media Day. I was there for that. I remember all of it. I remember when Khabib had I remember I interviewed Khabib. He had fucking the worst cotton mouth I'd ever seen on a fighter. Next day he can't fight Tony UFC 209. I mean, you see these things, but the point is this: whether it's in the fight or out of the fight, BC, boxing or MMA. Dude, this is a sport where like the most insane shit happens regularly. So like you're asking me, is it a conspiracy? It's like conspiracies are hard to coordinate. I think the most likely explanation is this sport is fucking batshit, and batshit things are the norm, and you just kind of got to get used to it.
I give credit, as you did, to all six fighters for being willing to make it happen. We've seen some discrepancy of Dana trying to claim that they didn't get paid bonuses to re-sign. Like they didn't, they fought for the same money they signed up for. I don't think that's possible. 2-1. And what do you think about what Dana said in the post-fight presser, where people were asking him about the potential matchups they could have made once Chimaev missed, and he was like, "Oh, they never would have made that because they were too far apart in weight," which was the exact far apart in weight that Li Jianliang and D-Rod ended up being. So I don't feel like he was telling the truth, or he just doesn't know about it.
Wow, a promoter not telling the truth. That seems...
Yeah.
that seems so out of...
Did you see Ariel send Dana to hell on Twitter, too?
No,
Ariel was like, don't praise Dana as the hero. It's really Hunter Campbell that made this happen. I'm happy they made it happen. They saved the card.
He's right. Yeah, Hunter Campbell's the guy who apparently engineered all of that.
But we do, and we said it last week, Nate and Dana, very chummy. Maybe that's the best thing to do for business moving forward because they all want to revisit.
To your point, we discussed this on Friday. Again, I've spoken to some folks close to Nate Diaz the past week several times, and what they were telling me was that, like, you know, more recently, not quite sure how recent, but you know, that's the way it was described to me, that there was a real thawing of the relationship between Nate Diaz and his camp and the UFC. To what you want to ascribe that, everyone can write their own version of things there. But it does seem like, dude, and again, we talked about it on Friday, like how much of the Anderson Silva kind of like, hey, thanks for the ride, asshole, the exit's that way, you know, how much of that influenced what they did here. Also, very quickly, you brought it up on Twitter for the Khamzat fight, but I also thought in the event with the fight with Nate, Joe Rogan asked him about boxing. Joe Rogan asked him about the end of his contract.
Shocked, I was shocked.
And you might be like, well, that's what he's supposed to do. Yes, but dude, let's be real. The UFC likes to, you know, kind of censor the message sometimes. They don't want those things necessarily brought to the forefront, and Joe did it. I give Joe credit for that. That was nice.
I give Joe credit a lot. I mean, there were times in the broadcast I thought they were ignoring it and just saying myriad of circumstances, but it was what it was in the end. But what a moment for Nate. What a moment after all the bad karma he's endured of the shitty purses he fought for, of maybe not getting the push he felt in certain moments he deserved, especially after the 2 McGregor fights and him sitting out 3 years. And now he was able to have this moment and walk away with his brand completely firm and be in a spot where he can literally go any direction he wants. And you don't have to take an L for that.
No.
I mean, that's just when Nate Diaz headlined the pay-per-view against Masvidal for the fake belt, it was like, this is surreal. I can't even believe we're here. I can't even believe in 2022 it ended up Nate Diaz versus Tony Ferguson. They tried their best, but Luke, that was weird. That was a weird-ass fight.
Before we get to the fight very quickly, let me ask one thing, a boxing comparison. Now, obviously, Canelo is in the prime of his career. Nate, I think, is at the prime of his earning potential, but as a fighter, I think he's past prime.
Yes.
I don't think that's crazy to say. Now, you remember what Canelo was doing. He fought briefly for Showtime when he fought Caleb Plant. Now he was with DAZN before. He's back with DAZN, but he's shopping, right? I think after the Golovkin fight, I'm not sure how much he's got left with whatever that situation is, but because he had the Bivol fight. It was a 2-fight deal, right? The Bivol fight and then the Triple G fight, right?
I think so, yes.
So in other words, the point is he's shopping around. Before Canelo signed with Showtime, just as a put that in a moment in time, how would you compare Nate Diaz's not earning potential, but is there any relevancy in the comparison between what Canelo was trying, given he's a much more vibrant and in his prime star, based relative to what Nate is doing in terms of free agent potential?
Not really, because Canelo got to a point where he's in that rare spot where he's the pound-for-pound king and the sport's biggest star without question at the same time. Yeah. Now look, Pacquiao and Mayweather still lingering. Could they be a bigger star in a certain fight? Of course, but you get the point in terms of active in their primes. I mean, they're both at a point where they have the same level of control now. So I guess that's the only level of comparison, to see Nate be able to walk away like this and to have them not trash him on the way. I mean, it's so bizarre. I can't get past it, Luke. I can't get past it. Shit moves quick in UFC. You get a really good card, you got a really good card 2 weeks later, right? I mean, sometimes every weekend. I can't get past how weird this was, that I want to sit in the conspiracy puddle longer to just try to help it make sense. Because if it's not a conspiracy, at the end of the day, I don't think it is. You don't see shit that weird.
Also, the UFC, I mean, you have to remember, like, their market power and their contracts, they make the nimbleness with which they showed in the rearrangement, those conditions make it a little more possible, right? So you have to remember that as well. Like, yes, the fighters deserve an enormous amount of credit, as does Hunter Campbell in the UFC, all the people who played a role, but this larger consideration about the constricting nature of their employment also makes that possible as well. So there's that thing.
Indeed.
Real question, last thing I'd ask you. Diaz, biggest free agent in MMA history. What do you think is the likely next path?
I think, we're on site here for the Jake Paul Anderson Silva boxing match, which I think
By the way, Jake Paul, very complimentary about Nate.
Absolutely.
Very complimentary.
I think he should be looking forward, as that's his big money fight. Short of getting Conor, and there's a great chance he'll never get a chance, where the windows won't match up, depending on Conor's UFC contract situation. But Nate is the Super Bowl fight for him. Anderson Silva is the hardest fight he's had since, and we don't know if he's going to win it. I mean, I really am starting to fall deeper in love with this fight because I really don't know what it's going to look like. Is it win or lose that's going to decide whether he ends up getting Nate? Maybe, or if it ends up being a loss for Jake, is it a really bad loss, or is it enough to warrant a rematch with Anderson? All that's going to be determined in the ring when they fight. But where should Nate go next? I think the biggest money is in Jake Paul, and that should be the fight that he's waiting for. Maybe Jake could fight him off a loss if that happened. Certainly with a win, it becomes a much bigger opportunity. We're not setting up for like Nate versus Anderson in a boxing match if things go a different way, right? Because you're like, here's what I want to spin it back on you. Boxing versus Jake is the most money and exposure he can make. He's talking about this as his halftime show and there's all this stuff. Maybe he's talking about the movie of his life and that kind of stuff. In terms of the next year, the biggest fights you can make, are we overlooking what it could mean if he went to a different MMA promotion and they tried to make the biggest fight available there? I say this, what if there's a reality in which Anderson wins this boxing match against Jake clear enough to not need to do Jake Diaz next? Could you do Anderson versus Anderson versus Nate in an MMA match on Bellator pay-per-view? Is that even possible? Him in one championship against Eddie Alvarez, is that even possible?
He would never go to one.
Not even for stupid money in the U.S. debut of one championship on U.S. soil, Eddie versus Nate as a pay-per-view main event. You're telling me that all parties involved wouldn't jump on that?
Okay, I'll put it as under those circumstances, it's a possibility. Sure, I couldn't dismiss that.
I mean, he's not going to enter the PFL playoffs tomorrow.
No,
That's not gonna
someone have asked me about it, could it be in PFL? I'm like, their chance of locking up Nate, even if they put in significant financial offer, is 0.
Although they are launching pay-per-view next year, so who knows?
I mean, with
who
him.
knows?
But
Maybe he'll fight Kayla. Who knows?
The point I'm trying to make is, I agree with you. I think that all roads lead to Jake Paul, but a few things have to happen along the way. I do think that Nate versus Anderson is
I mean, there's a weighty issue there. It'd have to be like the Nick versus Anderson
Possible,
fight.
yeah.
You'd have to meet somewhere in that middle.
possible. Well, I guess we'll have to see.
Are you talking about boxing or MMA with those?
Either. Either. Probably boxing, they'd make more money.